Berlin sensed its death long before the first Soviet shells landed. The winter of 1945 froze the city into a silent, ghostly wasteland, its streets lined with broken buildings and burned-out vehicles. The once vibrant capital of Hitler's empire now resembled a wounded giant, still towering but bleeding from 1,000 wounds. People whispered in cellars and ration lines that the Russians were coming, but the truth was even worse. Berlin was collapsing from within. Rumors flowed through the ruins like cold wind. Some claimed miracle weapons were coming. Others insisted the Americans would reach the city first. But most Berliners had seen too many funerals and too much fire to believe in salvation anymore. They rationed everything: light, laughter, hope, because even hope felt dangerous in the final days of the Reich. The nighttime sky glowed red from distant fires, and the ground trembled beneath the thunder of artillery. 4 months, Allied bombers had pounded the city until nearly every street bore scars of destruction. Walls were cracked open like old bones. Windows were mere holes. Roofs had collapsed. Berliners lived in caves made from what remained of their homes. Despite the devastation, the Nazi leadership insisted the capital would become a fortress. Propaganda broadcasts called for courage and sacrifice. Posters demanded civilians fight house to house. But Berliners had nothing left to give. Their sons were dead, their homes destroyed, their faith drained. Berlin was a fortress only on paper. Beneath the ruined chancellery, workers reinforced the Führer bunker. Its thick concrete ceiling became Hitler's last refuge, a tomb waiting patiently for its occupant. Nobody questioned why so much effort went into the bunker while neighborhoods above starved. The truth was obvious. The regime was preparing for death, not victory. In the streets, soldiers marched with blank faces, knowing their weapons were old and their ammunition scarce. Teenagers wore uniforms 2 sizes too big, clutching anti-tank weapons they barely knew how to use. Elderly men served as Volkssturm militia, limping through the snow with rifles older than they were. As the Soviet armies drew closer, Berlin's heartbeat slowed. The city no longer lived, it endured. Family by family, street by street, Berlin simply braced itself for the final blow. And all the while, the world watched as the last chapter of the Third Reich approached, one artillery shot at a time. No one doubted it anymore. The end was coming. And Berlin, once the proud capital of a rising empire, was preparing to meet it. The Red Army had been waiting for this moment for years. After the horrors of Stalingrad, Leningrad, and countless villages burned to ash, the Soviet Union wanted one final victory: the capture of Berlin. Soldiers carved marks into their rifles, swearing revenge for families lost. Commanders reminded their men of the crimes inflicted on their homeland. The march to Berlin became more than a military campaign. It was personal. Marshal Georgy Zhukov prepared his offensive with cold precision. His armies stretched for miles, endless columns of men and machines rolling toward the capital. Tanks churned the mud into thick black rivers. Artillery pieces lined up like iron giants waiting for the command to roar. This was not an attack, it was a tidal wave of steel and fury. Every village the Soviets passed through had already been ruined by the retreating Wehrmacht. Houses stood empty, animals wandered the fields, and roads were littered with the wreckage of destroyed vehicles. The closer the Red Army moved to Berlin, the more the land looked like a graveyard. The devastation only fueled their resolve. Behind the front lines, Soviet supply trucks clattered forward, carrying food, ammunition, and wounded soldiers packed together in tight rows. Even the young and inexperienced knew what capturing the Nazi capital meant. Berlin was the wolf's den, the place where Hitler had unleashed the war that consumed millions. Bringing it down would be the final justice. Zhukov and Konev, the 2 great Soviet marshals, raced each other toward Berlin. Stalin encouraged the rivalry, believing competition sharpened ambition. Each marshal wanted the credit. Each wanted the victory. And the city caught between their armies was about to drown in fire. By early April 1945, Soviet forward units reported seeing the towers of Berlin on the horizon. The soldiers cheered, shouting in Russian, Ukrainian, Georgian, Kazakh, and dozens of other languages. For the first time, the end of the war felt real. They could smell smoke from the burning city even before they entered it. Every kilometer the Soviets advanced tightened the noose around Berlin. Communication lines crumbled. German reinforcements never arrived. The once mighty Wehrmacht had been pushed back into the heart of its own capital. All that remained was the final assault, a storm of artillery and soldiers that would decide the fate of Europe. Berlin was trapped. The Soviet storm was coming. And nothing could stop it now. Beneath the ruins of the Reich Chancellery, Hitler's bunker felt like another world. The air was stale, heavy with cigarette smoke and fear. Generals shuffled through narrow corridors carrying reports they no longer believed in. Maps on the walls showed divisions that existed only in Hitler's imagination. The bunker had become a place where reality went to die. Hitler spent his days ranting at his generals, pounding on tables, and demanding counterattacks from units that had already been destroyed. His trembling hands revealed his worsening condition. His health deteriorated rapidly, his left arm twitched uncontrollably, his posture hunched, his voice cracked. But he still gave orders with the confidence of a man who believed the war could still turn. Eva Braun tried to maintain a sense of normalcy, hosting small gatherings in the bunker's dining room. She poured champagne and encouraged laughter, even as bombs shook dust from the ceiling. Her attempts at brightness only made the gloom more surreal. This was a doomed court trying to dance at the edge of oblivion. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann fed Hitler constant praise, shielding him from bad news. They hid the desperation of Berlin's defenders and exaggerated the strength of imaginary reinforcements. Their loyalty, half fanaticism and half fear, dragged the bunker deeper into a world detached from the city dying above them. Outside, the Reich Chancellery was a smoking ruin. Fires burned through its upper floors, and dead soldiers lay on the lawn where Hitler once gave speeches to cheering crowds. The bunker's thick concrete ceiling protected those inside from the worst of the bombardment, but the muffled explosions reminded everyone that their sanctuary was temporary. Hitler clung to the hope that General Wenck's Phantom 12th Army would come to Berlin's rescue. Day after day he demanded updates about Wenck's progress. His generals winced as they reported the truth. Wenck's army was just as broken as the rest, and it was moving away from Berlin, not toward it. By mid-April, the bunker became a prison of despair. Officers whispered in corners, wives cried in hallways, and staff wondered if they would ever see daylight again. Food supplies dwindled. Medical supplies disappeared. The smell of unwashed bodies grew overwhelming. Above them, Berlin burned. But below, the bunker clung to fantasy. And every passing day brought Hitler's world of delusion closer to its final collapse. Berlin's civilians endured a nightmare unlike anything they had ever imagined. With Allied bombing from the west and Soviet artillery from the east, the city shook non-stop. Every hour brought new explosions, new fires, new screams echoing through the ruins. Mothers clutched children in dark basements, praying the next shell wouldn't land on their building. Food became the city's most precious commodity. Bread lines stretched around piles of rubble where shops once stood. People traded jewelry for potatoes, shoes for scraps of meat, and blankets for a small handful of coal. Hunger hollowed faces and weakened bodies, but still the bombardment continued. Water pumps stopped working after constant shelling shattered the underground pipes. Civilians carried buckets to broken fountains or collected rainwater in pots. Washing became impossible. Disease spread. The city smelled of smoke, sewage, sweat, and death. But nobody had the strength to flee anymore. They were too deep inside the war to escape. The Hitler Youth patrolled neighborhoods, urging boys as young as 12 to join the final defense. Some volunteered eagerly, believing the lies they had been taught. Others hid in basements, terrified of being dragged into a battle they couldn't survive. The children who took up arms often didn't last long. Women feared what the arrival of Soviet troops might bring. Stories of vengeance and atrocities traveled quickly. Many hid in cellars, clutching knives, poison, or anything they believed might protect them. The uncertainty was unbearable. Was liberation coming or a new kind of terror? Air raid shelters filled with hundreds of people. They slept sitting upright, packed shoulder to shoulder. The shelter walls dripped with condensation. Babies cried through the night. The elderly slumped against the walls, too weak to react to the blasts above. Nobody could tell if it was day or night anymore. Even as Soviet forces entered the outskirts of the city, Berlin civilians still didn't know who controlled what. Streets changed hands several times a day. Snipers fired from rooftops. Tanks rolled past schools, churches, and playgrounds. Everything became a battlefield. Everywhere was dangerous. The people of Berlin were no longer living, they were surviving. And with every shell that landed, their hope faded further. The city had become a grave waiting to be filled, and its people were trapped inside it, praying the end would come quickly. The Soviet push into the outskirts of Berlin came with devastating force. Artillery units unleashed a barrage that shook the earth, sending plumes of dust into the sky as entire blocks collapsed. Soviet soldiers covered their ears, waiting for the ground to stop trembling. When the guns finally fell silent, the infantry advanced into a landscape that barely resembled a city. The first Soviet units entered Berlin's eastern districts, moving through streets lined with rubble and the charred remains of tramcars. The resistance they encountered was fierce but disorganized. Hitler Youth with Panzerfausts emerged from doorways, firing at tanks before sprinting away. Some made it. Others didn't. Soviet troops were shocked to see children fighting like seasoned soldiers. German defenders used every advantage the city offered: cellars, shattered walls, narrow alleyways. Machine gun nests turned intersections into killing zones. Snipers perched in the upper floors of ruined buildings, firing until Soviet artillery brought the entire structure down on top of them. Every street cost blood. Tanks rolled cautiously through the rubble, their turrets swiveling constantly. Soviet engineers worked behind them, clearing mines and explosive traps left by retreating German units. The advance was slow, brutal, and relentless. Berlin was fighting like a cornered animal, lashing out even as it bled. Civilians emerged cautiously from basements, waving white sheets. Soviet soldiers shouted for them to stay back, unsure who might be armed. Some civilians begged for water. Others asked where the Americans were. Many simply stared, numb, unsure if this was liberation or another danger to survive. As the Soviets penetrated deeper, the sky turned dark with smoke. Fire spread through entire neighborhoods, fed by broken gas lines and the dry wood of ruined buildings. The smell of burning corpses drifted through the streets, making soldiers nauseous. War had broken cities before, but Berlin felt different. It felt cursed. Despite the resistance, the Red Army pressed forward. Every meter taken brought them closer to the Reichstag, the symbolic heart of Nazi power. Soviet commanders knew the battle would only grow more savage the nearer they came to the center. The capture of the outskirts was just the beginning. The true battle for Berlin, the one that would decide the fate of the war, was about to begin. Berlin turned into a labyrinth of fire and rubble as Soviet troops pushed deeper into the city. Every building, every courtyard, every pile of debris became a battlefield. Soviet soldiers described the fighting as the most intense of the entire war. Tanks could barely move. Infantry had to take the city one doorway at a time. German defenders had dug into the ruins with desperate determination. They hid in basements, fortified stairwells, smashed windows and roofless attic beams. Snipers waited behind broken furniture. Machine gun teams shifted positions constantly to avoid being buried under Soviet artillery. It was urban combat at its most brutal. The Soviets countered with flamethrowers and grenades, clearing rooms and tunnels by sheer force. Streets that looked empty erupted suddenly with gunfire. The fighting became so close and so fast that soldiers often didn't know who held which floor of a building. Control of a single house could change 3 or 4 times in one afternoon. Dead horses lay in the streets, their bodies swollen and stiff. Civilians hacked off meat with knives, ignoring the shells landing nearby. Smoke mixed with dust to form a choking haze that blinded soldiers and left them coughing uncontrollably. The sun disappeared behind a permanent curtain of ash. Artillery thundered constantly. Soviet guns pounded positions only meters ahead of their own troops, a dangerous but necessary tactic to break German defenses. Whole buildings collapsed while men were still inside, burying defenders and attackers alike in the rubble. The city trembled as if it were alive and screaming. Civilians attempted to flee through the chaos, waving sheets or dragging carts loaded with what remained of their possessions. The elderly collapsed from exhaustion. Children cried but no longer screamed, they were too used to terror. Soviet soldiers tried to guide them to safety, but nowhere in Berlin was truly safe anymore. At night, the fighting didn't stop. Fires lit the city with a demonic orange glow, casting monstrous shadows across ruined walls. Soldiers slept in short, exhausted bursts, their nerves frayed by the constant crashes and the distant cries echoing through the ruins. By the end of April, the Soviets had pushed several kilometers into the city. The streets behind them were unrecognizable, reduced to piles of stone and ash. But the center of Berlin still lay ahead, and with it, the hardest battles of all. As Berlin crumbled above them, Hitler's inner circle struggled to maintain the illusion of control. Morale inside the bunker collapsed as quickly as the front lines outside. Generals arrived with grim faces, carrying news they dreaded giving. Divisions had been wiped out, supply lines were gone, and the Soviets were only blocks away. Hitler refused to accept reality. He berated commanders for cowardice, and accused entire units of betrayal. His orders became more delusional by the hour. He demanded counterattacks from units that no longer existed and reinforcements from directions where the Soviets had already broken through. His world was shrinking and he fought to keep the fantasy alive. Keitel and Jodl, once proud officers, now shuffled like ghosts through the bunker corridors, avoiding Hitler's explosive rages. They argued privately about surrender, but neither dared voice it in the Führer's presence. Hitler would rather see the entire German population perish than admit defeat. His obsession with victory or death condemned millions. Goebbels remained fiercely loyal. He delivered speeches promising miraculous salvation, even as he saw the Soviet artillery map closing in on the bunker. His wife, Magda, wandered the halls with a brittle smile, her eyes heavy with a secret dread. Everyone sensed she was preparing for something horrific. Bormann seized his chance to consolidate power. He controlled access to Hitler, manipulated information, and issued orders in Hitler's name. As the bunker became more chaotic, Bormann's influence grew. He saw the end coming and wanted to shape it to his advantage. Telephone lines crackled with static as reports came in from across the shrinking front. The defenders around the Brandenburg Gate had been overwhelmed. Tanks near the Tiergarten lay twisted in the rubble. The last remaining airfield had fallen. Even Hitler could no longer pretend the situation was salvageable. Inside the bunker, despair thickened like smoke. Officers whispered of suicide, escape, or surrender. Yet no one dared to take action. They were chained to the man who had led them into catastrophe, unable to break free even as the earth shook with Soviet bombardment. By late April, the German high command was a hollow shell, broken men clinging to a dying leader. They were no longer fighting the Allies. They were fighting the inevitable. For the Soviets, capturing the Reichstag was more than a military objective. It was symbolic. Raising the red banner over the building meant the final humiliation of Nazi Germany. Soviet propaganda had promised its soldiers that taking the Reichstag would avenge all of Europe's suffering. Every man wanted the honor. German defenders understood its symbolic importance as well. They turned the building and surrounding streets into a fortress. Machine gun nests were positioned behind pillars and sandbags. Snipers hid among the statues and carved stone. Mines littered the entrances. The Reichstag was wounded from previous bombings, but still strong enough to be deadly. As Soviet troops approached, the area around the Reichstag became a killing ground. The Germans held the higher ground and had excellent vantage points. Soviet soldiers sprinted from cover to cover, bullets snapping past their helmets. They used smoke grenades to obscure the defenders' sight lines, but the wind often changed direction, revealing them again. The battle inside the building was chaotic and terrifying. The corridors were dark, filled with rubble and corpses. Gunfire echoed off the walls, making it impossible to tell where shots were coming from. Soldiers fought at close range, often with knives, bayonets, and pistol butts. Hand grenades clattered down stairwells like falling stones. Fires burned inside the Great Hall, turning the once grand interior into a glowing furnace. Smoke made it nearly impossible to breathe. Soviet soldiers tied wet cloths around their faces and pushed forward. The Germans retreated slowly, room by room, determined to make the Soviets pay for every meter. Outside, more Soviet units poured into the square. Tanks blasted holes in the walls. Engineers set charges under barricaded entrances. The crack of sniper fire continued from the roof, even as the building shook under the assault. Everyone knew the end was near, but no one was willing to be the last man to fall. Finally, after hours of brutal combat, Soviet troops reached the roof. Amid gunfire, smoke, and chaos, they raised the red banner above the Reichstag. It was a moment of triumph, captured by war photographers, symbolizing the fall of the Nazi regime. Yet the cost had been enormous, and the fighting continued for days around the building. The Reichstag had fallen. The symbol of Nazi power now flew the flag of the Soviet Union. The end of the Third Reich was no longer approaching, it had arrived. On April 30, 1945, the bunker fell into a deathly silence. Soviet troops were only streets away, and the thundering artillery shook dust from the ceiling with every blast. Everyone inside sensed the shift. This was the day Hitler would decide his fate. No one expected him to leave the bunker alive. Hitler spent the morning pacing his room, muttering to himself. His body was frail, his clothes hung loosely on him, and his hands trembled uncontrollably. He summoned his remaining staff and shook their hands stiffly, thanking them for their loyalty. His voice was empty, drained of the fury that once shook nations. Eva Braun prepared for death with calm resignation. She changed into a simple dress and arranged her hair carefully. Those who spoke to her were struck by how peaceful she seemed, as if accepting the darkness closing around her. She had chosen to die with Hitler, believing life without him was meaningless. Hitler's final meal was a small plate of pasta. He barely touched it. He spoke quietly to his dog handler, asking about the cyanide capsule's effectiveness. Moments later he tested one on his beloved dog Blondie. When she collapsed, a part of the bunker staff realized the last hope for surrender had died with her. After lunch, Hitler and Eva retreated into his private study. The bunker fell silent. Guards stood motionless in the hallway. Minutes passed like hours. Then came the sound everyone knew would come, a single gunshot, sharp and final. The end of Adolf Hitler was not dramatic. It was a simple crack behind a closed door. When aides entered, they found Hitler dead on the sofa, a pistol still in his hand. Eva lay beside him, lifeless from cyanide. Their bodies were carried upstairs through the ruined Chancellery garden. Soviet shells exploded nearby, showering debris as staff hurriedly poured gasoline over the corpses and set them ablaze. The fire crackled weakly. The bodies refused to burn completely. Even in death, Hitler's exit seemed incomplete, a final act of failure. Bormann watched with cold detachment, while others turned away, unable to look. The smoke drifted into the gray sky over Berlin. With Hitler dead, the Third Reich had no leader. The bunker was no longer a command center, it was a tomb waiting for its final occupants. Hitler's death spread through the bunker like a ghostly whisper. Some felt relief, others shock, and others only numbness. The man who had led Germany into catastrophe was gone, yet the chaos he created still consumed the city. No one knew what would happen next. Goebbels assumed control, but his authority was meaningless. The war was lost, the armies destroyed, and the Soviets were already surrounding the government district. He tried to reorganize a defense, but officers ignored him. They were too busy planning their own survival or escape. Outside, Berliners had no idea Hitler was dead. They cowered under bombardment, still hearing propaganda broadcasts urging them to fight on. The news would not reach them until much later, and by then the battle for their lives was already decided. German defenses collapsed rapidly. Units that once swore loyalty retreated or surrendered. The chain of command dissolved. Some soldiers threw away their weapons and disappeared into the ruins. Others continued fighting out of habit, not hope. The city was no longer defended by strategy, it was defended by inertia. Goebbels drifted through the bunker like a shadow. His wife, Magda, had made a horrifying decision. She believed her children could not live in a world without National Socialism. One by one she gave them morphine, then crushed cyanide between their teeth. Her final act shocked even hardened officers who recoiled at the sight. Above ground, fire spread unchecked. Entire blocks glowed red against the night sky. Explosions echoed endlessly. Smoke covered the city like a funeral shroud. Berlin seemed to wither in slow motion, a dying beast gasping its final breaths. Goebbels and Magda stepped into the Chancellery garden and ended their lives shortly after Hitler. Their bodies burned in the same place as had hours earlier. The flames sputtered, struggling against the wet spring air. The once powerful propaganda minister died without an audience. With the leadership dead or fleeing, Berlin drifted leaderless through its final hours. The city lay broken, silent, and waiting for surrender. Without Hitler's orders forcing them to fight, pockets of German defenders began surrendering across the city. The first white flags appeared in windows, fluttering from torn bedsheets and tablecloths. Civilians stepped cautiously into the streets, waving makeshift banners, hoping Soviet soldiers would spare them. Some German officers tried to maintain discipline, forcing soldiers to continue fighting despite the hopelessness. But many refused. They were exhausted, starving, and traumatized. They wanted to live. In some units, younger soldiers abandoned their posts and fled to find their families. Older veterans sat with their heads in their hands, waiting for the Soviets to arrive. Soviet troops approached cautiously. They had learned that not every white flag was honest. Some buildings hid snipers or last-minute ambushes. The soldiers kicked open doors, shouted warnings, and searched for weapons. Fear and confusion made every encounter tense and unpredictable. Civilians approached Soviet soldiers with trembling voices. They offered whatever they had, bread, watches, jewelry, in exchange for safety. Many women begged for protection. The chaos of the city's fall made everything uncertain, and each street brought new dangers. German officers attempted to negotiate, but their authority meant little. Soviet unit commanders gave their own terms: surrender unconditionally or be destroyed. There was no space for diplomacy. The Red Army had come too far, lost too much, and suffered too deeply to bargain. Hospitals overflowed. Nurses tended to wounded civilians and soldiers with dwindling supplies, improvising bandages from curtains and sheets. Surgeons worked by candlelight, operating on injuries caused by collapsing buildings, tank shells, and starvation. The moans of the dying filled the corridors. As the Soviets advanced block by block, Berlin's defenses crumbled entirely. The once mighty capital of the Third Reich had reached its breaking point. Its people were waving white flags not just for surrender but for survival. By May 1st, the collapse was undeniable. The city was surrendering itself, piece by piece. On May 2nd, General Helmuth Weidling made the decision that would save what remained of the city. With no food, no ammunition, no reinforcements, and no hope, he ordered the unconditional surrender of Berlin's remaining defenders. A white flag was raised over the command post. It marked the end of the battle. Weidling was escorted through the devastated streets to Soviet headquarters. Soviet soldiers observed him with a mixture of anger and respect. He was a defeated enemy but also a man doing what Hitler would not, ending the suffering of civilians and soldiers still alive in the ruins. Inside the Soviet command post, Weidling formally surrendered the city. His voice was steady, but those who listened could hear the exhaustion behind the words. He apologized for the destruction inflicted by the defenders and asked only for mercy for the remaining civilians. The Soviets agreed. With the signature of surrender, the guns across Berlin fell silent. After 2 weeks of relentless combat, the city finally stopped shaking. The quiet that followed was eerie and unsettling. People emerged from basements, blinking in the gray morning light, unsure whether to believe the silence was real. Soviet troops began disarming German soldiers across the city. Streets filled with long lines of Wehrmacht and Volkssturm fighters, their weapons piled at intersections. Many marched with heads lowered, knowing they were going into captivity. Others cried openly, relieved to be alive. Civilians watched as the occupation began. Soviet officers organized water distribution and food centers. Medical units treated wounded civilians when possible. But revenge also swept through parts of the city. Berlin experienced both liberation and brutality, often within the same block. The Reich Chancellery District, once the heart of Nazi power, became a ghost zone. Soviet soldiers searched the bunker and found the remnants of a regime that had burned itself out. They found empty rooms, charred remains, and walls still echoing with fear. The fall of Berlin marked the symbolic death of the Third Reich. What began with triumphal marches ended in ashes, surrender, and a silence heavy with loss. Berlin after the surrender looked like a vision of the end of the world. Entire neighborhoods were gone, reduced to smoking piles of concrete and twisted metal. Buildings that still stood were gutted shells, their insides exposed like broken bones. Streets were filled with burned vehicles, unexploded ordnance, and the debris of millions of shattered lives. Civilians wandered through the ruins searching for loved ones. Some found family members alive in basements, weak but breathing. Others walked through the rubble calling names that never answered. The city became a vast cemetery with no gravestones, only memories and the faint hope of reunion. The smell of death lingered everywhere. Teams of Soviet soldiers and German volunteers worked to clear bodies from the ruins. Many were unrecognizable. Others were buried under collapsed buildings, never to be recovered. Funerals were improvised, hurried, and heartbreaking. Water systems were destroyed. People lined up at makeshift wells or waited hours for water trucks to arrive. Food scarcity remained severe. The Soviets distributed rations, but the needs of millions could not be met overnight. Hunger continued to haunt the city long after the fighting ended. Despite the devastation, small signs of life emerged. Children ventured into the streets, curious but cautious. Women gathered bricks to rebuild walls. Men cleared rubble from roads and tried to repair broken carts. The instinct to survive was stronger than despair. Soviet authorities established order district by district. They reopened hospitals, cleared main roads, and enforced curfews. The occupying forces were sometimes harsh, sometimes helpful, always unpredictable. Berliners learned quickly to avoid conflict and adapt to their new reality. In the evenings, Berlin fell into a deep, uneasy quiet. Fires burned in metal barrels for warmth. Families huddled together in whatever shelter they could find. Through the silence came distant echoes, faint reminders of what the city once was. Berlin was defeated, starving, and broken. But it was alive. And in the ruins lay the seeds of its rebirth. As Berlin struggled to survive, the Allies began shaping its future. The city was divided into sectors controlled by the Soviets, Americans, British, and French. It was a division drawn on maps by people who had not walked the ruined streets below. Yet these lines would define the next chapter of Berlin's history. The Soviets controlled the eastern half of the city, including the government district and the ruins of the Reichstag. They saw themselves as liberators and conquerors, and their policies reflected both pride and vengeance. They repaired key infrastructure quickly but also imposed strict political control. In the western sectors, American and British forces arrived to scenes of devastation. They brought food, medical care, and organized assistance. Berliners viewed them with hope, believing Western occupation might offer a chance at a better future. Yet even in the West, scarcity and fear remained constant companions. The division of the city created tension. Former neighbors found themselves living under different flags. Families were split by borders drawn through streets and across riverbanks. Suspicion grew as each side established its own police, administration, and ideology. The Allies met formally to discuss Germany's future. The decisions made in those meetings would shape Europe for decades. Berlin, once the heart of the Nazi Empire, became the first battleground of the emerging Cold War. The ruins were still smoking when the world began choosing sides again. Despite the political maneuvering, ordinary Berliners tried to rebuild their lives. They salvaged bricks from collapsed houses, repaired bicycles, and turned bomb craters into gardens. Survival was not just about living, it was about reclaiming humanity after years of darkness. Children born in the ruins grew up playing among burned-out tanks and shattered walls. Their world was divided, but they learned to adapt. The city's future was uncertain, but its people were determined to rebuild from nothing. Berlin's division marked the beginning of a new era. The war had ended, but history was still moving, reshaping the city in ways nobody could yet imagine. The fall of Berlin was more than the collapse of a city, it was the end of a nightmare that had consumed the world. The ruins became symbols of both destruction and resilience. Foreign journalists walked through the rubble, stunned by the scale of devastation. Their reports captured the world's collective breath. This was the true cost of tyranny. For survivors, the memories never faded. They remembered the roar of bombs, the hunger that clawed at their stomachs, the fear of footsteps in the night, and the moment when the guns finally fell silent. Trauma lingered in every brick and shadow of the rebuilt city. The Soviets hailed the victory as justice for the millions who had suffered under Nazi aggression. The red banner atop the Reichstag became an image etched into the story of World War II. For many Soviet veterans, Berlin was the final act of vengeance, and of sacrifice. Their losses had been immense. For Germans, the fall was both defeat and liberation. It exposed the lies of the Nazi regime and forced the nation to confront its responsibility. In the years that followed, Germany rebuilt not just its cities, but its identity. The ruins of Berlin became painful reminders of a path the nation vowed never to walk again. The world learned from Berlin's fall. The destruction showed the consequences of unchecked power, hatred, and blind obedience. It became a warning for future generations, a testament to the fragility of peace and the price of war. As Berlin slowly transformed into a modern city, traces of 1945 remained. Monuments rose where heroes had fallen. Memorials marked the suffering of civilians and soldiers alike. The past was never erased, it was woven into the new city's identity. Today, Berlin stands as a symbol of survival. Its streets, once filled with fire and death, now carry the footsteps of a free people. The city that fell rose again, rebuilt from ashes into a place of culture, unity, and remembrance. The fall of Berlin marked the end of the Third Reich, but its legacy endures. A reminder of the darkness humanity can create, and the strength it takes to rise again.